Hello, guys. Welcome. I think some people will be running late, so we're gonna kick off and just wait for them to join. Happy Friday, everyone. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. My goal today is to talk about how to conduct customer and prospect interviews. It is a very important topic just because everything you do in marketing and pretty much in product marketing or in product management, it deals with talking to your customers. And I feel very passionate about this topic because often we seem it's easier for us to kind of avoid these conversations because it is difficult, because it is uncomfortable to talk to the customers. And this is why I wanted to walk you through the process and walk you through the steps of how to conduct effective customer interviews. So, and by the way, my name is Mick Pono, and most of you know some of my work and some of the articles that I've written on marketing and product growth. So I'm not gonna spend time introducing myself any longer. So with that, we're gonna have 5 parts to this webinar, and it's gonna take about an hour, and then we're gonna have about 20-30 minutes where everybody will have a chance to ask questions, and I hope to answer some of the specific questions that you have. Maybe you have some questions about how to, what questions to ask on the interview and so forth. So we're going to talk about it. First, we're going to talk about planning the interviews, then we're going to talk about how to set interviews, how to reach out to people, then how to conduct interviews and manage the conversation with your customers. And the fourth part will be about how to analyze and summarizing the feedback. So first of all, let's talk about objectives. The objective that I have for this webinar is for you to understand the effective, the principles that make the customer interview effective. And the second one is that I want to leave you with everything you need to know and the framework that you later will be using to design and implement your own interviews. So after this webinar, I will provide you with a PDF that will have all the outline steps that we're going to be discussing today. So with that, first of all, let's talk about why you should do customer interviews. We touch about it a little bit, but I think it's important to highlight that every single product that you're building or you're working on is the product that focus on a specific type of customer, on specific people they want to talk to. So you can't please everyone. So if you are trying to build a product for everyone, that means that you're building product for no one, because you're trying to be everything for everyone, and that's not possible. That's why you want to talk to your customers, identify your segment, and make sure that you focus your conversations on that particular segment. Second is that talking to a customer allows you to have this feedback loop about what you're building, about your product, to be very short, meaning that you can talk to your customers right away, you can get that feedback, and those companies that are actually closer to the customers, who have the shortest cycle of these feedbacks, actually win, because they can iterate faster, they can change their product, they can change their messaging, they can change their marketing, because they consistently learn from their customers. And this is why we'll talk at the end why it is important to conduct customer interviews on a regular basis, whether it's once a week or at least once per quarter or once per month. And three is that it is important to understand not just the general things that happen, but the kind of problems you want to solve for customers, but you want to understand the context of the problems, because problem itself can tell you quite a bit about the customers, but understanding the actual context in the environment in which customer lives, what are the things that happen inside of the company, how the team is set up, what are the things that that they worry about, that context will allow you to understand better of the problem that the customers have. So the customer interviews, as I said, it's important for multiple reasons. But if you develop a new product, before you start developing, before you start coding, you want to set up 20, 30, 40 customer prospect interviews. So those people who you know, that you're going to be selling your product. You want to set this up, you want to understand the problems, you want to test your assumptions, and then go and try to develop an MVP that will solve this problem. If you have already have a product that you want to improve, talking to customers on a regular basis will help you adjust the product, will help you adjust and create new features. The same with the launching new features. Very often you want to talk to your customers and actually showcase them the feature and see how they would be using it, whether your assumption about what problem this feature will solve or what value it provides will be is accurate. So that's why you want to talk to your customers. And if you want to create your ideal customer profile, and I have written an article about that, you can go check it out afterwards if you haven't yet, is that every company and every marketing organization should have an ideal customer profile. Ideal customer profile makes sure that your sales, your product marketing team, your customer success understand who this ideal person that we're selling to and getting on the same page. So in order to create that, you have to talk to your customers and identify who those people are. And the same goes with the strategic messaging, because when you create a strategic messaging, you want to understand how your customers talk about your product, how they talk about the problem, because this will impact how you're going to define your benefits, how you're going to talk about the benefits of your product. So what makes an effective customer interview? So there's two things that makes effective customer interview. And the first one is a surprising insight. So the goal of interviews is to have the conversation with the customers that uncover something important, that uncover something that you haven't heard before, something that you haven't learned before, or something that might be surprising. So that's one of the things that makes it effective. Number two is that you want your information that you learn from interviewing your customers to be actionable, meaning that you want to get information from the customers that you can later implement something. You want to do something with it. You don't want to just have this conversation and know about it. You want to either improve your product or improve your messaging or improve your marketing campaigns. Whatever that is, it has to be actionable. So with that, this is an introduction. So let's talk about the first step. It's probably one of the most important steps is planning for the interviews. So the key for successful interviews is you need to formulate the problem. You want to understand what you're actually trying to get from those customers. What is the reason for you to have those interviews? What's the purpose for that? And typically you'll have just one or two sentences, and I'll show you later this webinar. A couple of just one sentence of what you want to learn from these interviews. This way you'll be always focused on asking the questions and setting up the stage for getting that information. Second, you want to talk to the right people, meaning that you want to talk to the people who actually have insight in the problem you're trying to solve. Because if you're talking to people who obviously have no access to this problem or have not experienced it, you're not going to get a very actionable feedback. So you want to talk to the right people. Sometimes it's going to be the users of the product who are dealing with this problem on a daily basis. Sometimes it could be decision makers, but those people who actually know about the problem you want to learn about. So number three is you want to ask the right question and do it in the right way. And we're going to talk about this in more details, but you want to ask questions that help you uncover the stories, uncover information from those interviews. And you want to do it in the right way. You don't want to ask too many questions. It's not interrogation of your customer. It's a conversation, but you want to have this conversation in a way that customer will be willing and trusted to share that information with you. And number four, it's create uniform structure for customer interviews. So this is where the structure of your interview matters. Is that when do you have it? How long does your interviews go? What type of tools do you use? What is the operational things that you need to set up to make your interviews effective? And number five, it's very important. You want to record your interviews, and I will share later how to ask for recordings for the interviews, and most of the people are okay for recording their interviews because and for you it provides a lot of value because you don't want to get distracted by making notes. You want to just focus on active listening with your customer. and but not having to be distracted, take very good notes, because you always can go back and review your recording. So let's talk about formulating the problem. So the first step that I want to sort of, when you decide that you want to set up a customer interviews, you want to formulate the problem. What do I want to achieve? So for example, on the business side in your organization, you can have the goal of, well, we want to build the first product. So this is your internal goal, but at the same time, the research of your goals, the goal of the talking to the customers is a little bit different. Because if you want to build a new product, that means you want to learn about how prospect currently solve this problem. You want to learn how to identify the problem in the priorities of other things that the customer has to worry about, understand the responsibilities. So for example, if you want to get feedback on a new product or feature, you want to understand what type of problems this feature solves, or what type of values this feature provides. And this will require you to understand maybe how the customers actually using your product now, and how this feature going to fit in that discussion. And for example, if your objective as your team, or your objective, organizational objective, is to create ideal customer profile, then you need to understand your research goals would be to identify core elements of your prospect of your prospect's buying journey, or what is the rational and emotional values that your customers have attached to that problem. So make sure that before you start, you formulate the problem of the research, what you want to do. So when you do research on the problem for the customers, uh, the problem itself, typically, when you go on the phone with the customers, you ask them, hey, do you have this problem? And they say yes or no. So this is not the best way to go about it. You want to understand problem in a more deep way. You want to first understand what is the objective that the decision maker have. What does it want to achieve? So for example, let's say your company provides helps teams manage creative assets, right? So with the things that you can ask is, tell me more about what's your objective of typical projects where you have a lot of design assets involved in it. So this way you can understand not just the problem of how they manage the actual design assets, but also what type of problem, what type of projects do they work on that help you understand sort of the objectives of those projects that they have. So number two is that when you analyze the problems that the customers have, think about the context. So for example, let's go back to the example of the product that provides ability to manage creative assets. What you want to understand is how many assets do you typically have? What type of people are involved in this project? Do you typically manage assets between internal teams or external teams? How many assets do you have? Again, what type of projects they're solving on? So this way you can understand this whole scope of context that this actually happens in. So number three, you want to understand the priority of the problem. Very often when we have a customer interviews, we want to zero in on the problem that we solve, the problem that we actually solve as a team or our product solves, but will provide you much better understanding of the customer if you're going to talk about in general first and try to understand all the problems that they currently have, because sometimes the problem that you will solve will not going to be on their priority. So for example, let's go back to this example of the companies that that helps manage creative assets. So let's say they learn about what type of projects and objectives of this project that the company is trying to solve. You understand who is involved in managing those assets, between what teams they have to be shared, what kind of problem they have, how many assets they have. But you also want to understand, like, is managing creative assets is a high priority for them? What are the problems in developing the design projects or designing a website? What are the problems that the typically teams have? And then the reason why you want to get this information is that then you want to ask them to prioritize the problem that they have, and figure out where your problem fits on a list of priorities. Because if it's number 10, that means maybe your problem is not very important, or maybe you're not talking to the right customer. You want to figure out who's inside of the organization where the problem that you solving is in top 1 or 2 or 3. Otherwise, it's not going to be very important for them to solve it. And number 4 is what is the current alternative to solving this problem? So, for example, again, let's go back to this example of the company that helps manage creative assets between the teams. What are current alternatives that you currently use? You want to ask your customers, so tell me more about how do you manage assets right now, and what alternatives do you have? Do you use Google Drive to manage that? Are you not using it all? Are you using email? Again, this type of questions will allow you to analyze your potential solution with what type of alternatives or what type of competitors they're currently using. And this way you can understand how to position your product better. And number 5, when you're analyzing the problem of your customers, you want to understand who makes a decision, who makes a buying decision, who's responsible to solving the problem. And very often in a large organizations, it's not just one person, and maybe it's a few people involved in buying decisions. So again, let's go back to the example with a company that provides that helps manage creative assets. Maybe the product that you design is mostly for designers and marketing teams. So you want to understand like who's actually will be buying this product. Like if you're talking to designer, for example, like the way I would ask this question is that, do you typically buy some other products for your professional use? Do you have a credit card? Do you have a budget for that? And if you would have to buy this product or test the product, like who else in the organization will be involved in this? As a marketing, will have to be part of it, or this is some decision that you can make yourself. So that's the first step, is formulate the problem that you want to solve for the research, but also understand the problem that you want to try to understand that the customer have at this point. So asking the right people. Well, first of all, identify the decision makers. Again, I think it's important that you're talking to people who have some power to solve this problem. Number 2 is interview customers and prospects. And this is a big topic because very often, if the companies want to understand what feature to build, they typically just talk to the people, to the customers who are already paying for the product. But it's also important to talk to the prospects, to the companies who are not yet your customers, who do not know your product yet, because they will provide a different perspective. There might be certain reasons why they're not using your product or they're not willing to try your product. So when you do your customer interviews, I highly recommend to have the pool of your own customers as well as the prospects who are your target audience, who might be your customers but not using your product quite yet. So when you looking to do a customer interviews, make sure you have a very large variation of in behaviors and profile of the customers, because this will allow you to get as much perspective as possible. So let's get back to example of the company that helps manage creative assets, for helps manage the designs, logos for organizations. And you want to talk to a small company, maybe it's just a few people, and understand how they manage assets between them. You want to talk to the large organization, maybe they have hundreds and thousands of assets, because you want to understand you want to understand different types, extremes of the usage of the product. And this is what number 4 is, that you wanted to speak with extreme users and mainstream users as well. So when I was doing a series of customer interviews for Publish Now, we were building a product for marketing content teams to make it easy for them to launch a publication and engage readers. We talked to over 200 people, and the way we wanted to talk to people who do a lot of content, because we wanted to know, if you do a lot of content, what type of problems do they have, and does some of those problems become bigger with the amount of content and with the size of organization. And we also wanted to talk to the companies that do not do a lot of content, because we wanted to learn what's the reason for them to not to do a lot of content. Is it because there are certain limitations they have? Maybe they don't have the resources they can invest. Maybe they are limited to some other things. But this is why you want to talk to extreme users, somebody who would use a lot of your product, and somebody who might not use your product at all. Or who maybe, it's not just about using the product, let me rephrase that, it's about the problem. Maybe somebody who has a larger problem, so extreme use case, and somebody who has a lower level of problem. So the right questions and asked in the right way. So the way you want to divide your interview in 3 parts. The first, you're going to get on the phone with your customer. You want to introduce yourself. You want to say why you want to talk to them. You want to let them introduce themselves and their company. Then you're going to have sort of the meaty part of the interview. This is where you're going to ask questions. This is where you're going to dig into the details of the interview. And at the end, you want to summarize the interview and be respectful of the time and be able to close the interview quite quickly, because you don't want to interview go to extend to the amount of time that you actually set for the customers the interview will take. So get to know your customers. First of all, introduce yourself. Don't take too much time. Tell them to who you are, what company you work for, and then ask your customers to introduce themselves. Typically, what I do in the interview, I say, hey, I've seen you work for these companies. Can you briefly, in a couple of sentences, summarize your career? This will give me sort of a perspective of where they're coming from, what type of position they had, what type of companies they work as. And I also ask them questions about the team and responsibility. So, great to hear about your career, but also tell me more about your responsibilities and teams in your current organization. The same goes for the question about a typical day. What I want to understand is what is the typical steps and activities they do during the day, and how it typically looks, because this again will provide me some context of how the customers operate. And the good question to ask here as well is, what is your goals and objectives, and just in general. This is more of a question for a position. I mean, obviously, if you're in sales, your objective may be drive revenue. If you're marketing, that could be generating leads. But you want to sort of still make sure that you ask this question, because you want to kind of understand what is the one thing or 2 things that your customers are worried about on a daily basis. And then you can start drilling down into the challenges, because typically you would have the problem that your customers would want to achieve, something they want to drive the results in their organization. And then there are certain challenges, and the challenges may be in different forms. It could be they have lack of resources, their team is not set up for do it, they have a outdated process. But this is a way to transition from the first part interview introduction into the meaty gritty details about the challenges and the problem that your customer have. So then when you identify the problem, so you identify the challenge that you want to drill down, then you want to ask a series of questions that will help you understand more details. So for example, you want to ask them a question, well, let's go back to the example of the company that helps manage creative assets. Let's say you want to do interview for that company. The way I would do it is that I would say, well, tell me the last time about the project where your team had to manage a lot of assets, or it was very problematic. And I let them speak through the story. I let them talk to me in more details of what was the project about, what did it uncover, who was involved. And next, you can talk to them about who was involved in the project and in what capacity. So you were launching the website. There was a lot of creative pieces involved. Who else was approval? Was it C-level as well? How did you guys communicate? How the assets were sent to each other? So this is a type of questions I want them to elaborate on. Then. What you want to do also is to not just focus on the problems, but also understand their successful results. So what I would do is let's say, so tell me a project where it was so complicated that you had so many assets to manage. It was so difficult. But then I would also ask them a question about, tell me about the time where the project went well. And what was, why do you think it went well? And how did you find success? Is it the number of emails you sent? Is it the amount of time it took, and so forth? Then you also want to ask questions about the challenges. And if you see the questions that I have here, is that you ask them not just in general questions about like, what do you think of the problems are, but now you start drilling down into specific use case. So tell me about the last project, and you start unpacking what actually entailed in this project, what type of problem that they faced in this project, who was involved, and all the details about the outcomes and processes. You want to know about positive and negative outcomes as well. So the other question that while you're unpacking this steps of a specific problem or specific story that the customer had, where they go and experiencing the problem that you're trying to solve in your organization, one of the questions that I really like to ask is, in an ideal world, how would you like to see this problem done? How would you like to solve this? So this will allow you to sort of engage your customers in sort of a little bit creative process. So sometimes they'll come up with some ideas that you might use later on. Maybe they will tell you something that that would help you understand their organization or their job a little bit better. What kind of in an ideal world, how would you like to see this done? And very often this question will it will be sort of awkward silence. I suggest you kind of wait and do not try to provide some ideas here that may be related to your product, but just wait, let them think about it, and don't direct them, because this is a question that is sort of a creative question. They'll have to think about what's an ideal world would look like for them. So this is a couple of examples. So this is something that I will share with you at the end of the call. But this is a doc. It's half a page doc that I've created when I was conducting an interview for Publish Now. And basically at the top, I put together, what the goals were for conducting these interviews. Then I outlined very quick titles of the people I want to talk to. And then basically I scripted the call in a way that allowed me to sort of scan through it and making sure like I'm on the right track to actually asking the question. So as you can see, first we would introduce ourselves, and the guest will introduce themselves, and then we go through some of the questions that allow to understand the context of the person. Then I'll basically ask, is it okay for us to record the call? I typically say that this call not going to be shared with anyone else. This is for us to just focus on the conversation and don't be distracted by taking notes. And I have to say that out of 200 interviews that I've done for Publish Now, I had only once where somebody told me that they are not comfortable to record the interview, and then we had to abide by the rules. But definitely do not record on the background. This is sort of maybe not very ethical these days, but I think if you be upfront and ask people to record interview, I would be surprised if you have a lot of rejections. Then you'll have a goal. In this particular case, the goal for our interviews was to understand the process of how companies create, publish, and distribute content. So this is something that I would also say during the interview, that the goal of this is for us to just learn how you go about this process. So this is a continuum of that doc, and this basically outlines some of the questions we already talked about, the introduction where you want to get the context of the person. But then what I have done here is I broke down the process of content creation. First, you create the content, then you publish the content, and then you track and analyze the content. So in this sort of progression, when I ask them questions, it makes easier for customer to kind of walk through the process, because you want to sort of understand the process the way they typically go. And this is just a list of questions that I've asked. And again, I'll share that with you. This basically talks about, first I highlighted here that we're going to be talking about content production. You want to outline what type of questions you have here. And again, at the end, I always talk about the challenges that they have in this step of the process and what they would like to see in ideal world happen. And again, this is goes, then I go back and ask questions about the publishing part of the content. What are the steps they go about the publishing content? I ask questions about the last time you've published content. Can you tell me about how long it took you to put call to action on the page? What's the format of the images you had, and all those steps. The same goes with distribution. This is just an example, and you can build your customer interview script based on it. There's a couple of things that I like to highlight if I have time, and typical interviews is about 30 minutes with a customer. I think it's very difficult to get more, but 30 minutes is about the standard. And if you have time, it's good to understand the metrics. This is where you want to ask questions about how do you measure user success? How do you actually understand the challenges? How do you actually calculate the ROI of your content, or ROI of understanding that this is a marketing campaign is successful? So how would you track that success? And the other piece, the questions that I like to ask is about the future in the industry and the future plans in organizations. So. So for example, let's go back to the example with the company that helps manage creative assets. What I would ask is questions like, hey, do you plan to have more creative assets going forward? Are your projects getting bigger? By the way, is there anything in the industry that you see is changing too? Because you also want to make sure that you are on top of important trends that you want to learn from your customers. So if you have time in your conversation with customers, focus on their future plans, focus on the things that how the organization will change, but also if there's anything that happens in the industry that they're paying close attention to. So let's talk about the interview questions. Couple of things here. When you create interview questions, you should prioritize questions that start with "Tell us about the last time this happened," or "Tell us about last time your organization had to manage, your team had to manage," versus what, who, and how. The reason for that is when you ask "Tell us the last time," that means they'll have to remember, your customers have to actually remember the story. Oh, okay, I remember that we had a website design, and they start actually talking about what happened, so you can actually understand the story. If you're going to ask them generic questions, abstract question, hey, how do you generally manage the product? They're going to talk about very generic ways, and this is going to be quite often very misleading. And it's not because people lie to you, but because they try to project themselves in a different way. They try to project the organization, their processes in a better way. So they might create some process on the fly that doesn't actually exist. So when you ask questions, "Tell us the last time this happened to you," that will require them to actually remember the time think about it, and tell you exactly what happened. And then you can take that information and see, okay, this is more practical. This is more practical process because they actually have, this is actually what happened. So think about that when you create your interview questions. Number two, don't expect direct answers. Look for context. So this is the great example I can give here, that when we talk about publish now, not about publish now, never talk about your products on customer interviews. When we interviewed people about content creation process, there was interesting part when we just started. I made quite a big mistake of actually asking, hey, well, so you're using WordPress, right? And they say yes. And so how do you like it? And it's like, yeah, they like it. And this is such a big mistake that I made, because what happens is that when you ask questions this way, you want a direct answer and you're not getting it. So then over a few interview calls, I changed my approach, and I started asking them not to tell me about their experience with WordPress. I started to ask them about the process. So you have WordPress, right? Now tell me the last time you had to publish article, and walk me through the process you had to go. So then they'll tell me, well, I have content in Google Docs, then I copy paste it in WordPress, then I spend about 20 minutes editing it. That if I need to add call to actions, it takes me another 5 minutes. And then this will allow me to get the actual context, because if they ask them direct questions, they might not realize that they actually have a 10-step process that takes 2 hours. And then you can go back to your team. You can look at this process. It's 10 steps. They shared what it is, and you can say, how about you remove 5 of them? That's going to be huge value for organizations. So do not ask direct, don't expect direct answers what to do. Understand the context in which your customers operate. Number two, always ask open-ended questions and do not ask closed-ended questions. So this is, I think, pretty obvious that you want to ask questions that require more than just yes or no. You want to ask questions that allow your customers to tell a story. And this will allow them to provide more information. Remember, the customer interview, the goal of customer interview is for you to extract as much information as possible from your customers, and you want to ask the questions in a way that allow you to get as much information as possible. Number four, I think it's pretty obvious. I think everybody understands that you have to ask for actual for the actual problems, but also ask for successes. Ask how they if there is anything they've done that is successful. The reason for that is that if you talk to 20, 30 customers, and one of them actually had a very unique way to solve the problem, or a unique way to improve their process, then you can take this feedback, you maybe can align your product with it, and you can replicate the success for the other customers. So make sure that you look not for the problems, but also understand successes. Or maybe they've done something, maybe they improved process that that you can use and maybe improve your product this way. This is quite important. It's leave your beliefs at the door and don't ask leading questions. I'm going to talk about it again a little bit later, but early, this is the goal of the interview and the customers is to get information from the customers. If you don't want to interject your beliefs, you don't want to ask questions like, well, this managing creative assets is probably very difficult, isn't it? So you don't want to have that question. The same way as I already gave you an example with WordPress, where you don't want to go with a question that says, well, managing and publishing content is very difficult, isn't it? This is a question that leads them to a very easy answer, and you already have your beliefs replicated in your question. So try to have the conversation with customers where your beliefs are shielded. It's very difficult to do, but you don't want to project what you're thinking, or what do you believe the process should be, or the problem should be solved, like, because it's very easy for customers to get attuned to that and actually tell you not what they think, but what they think you want them to hear. Yeah, so this is an example of one of those questions. It is so difficult to track content ROI, isn't it? So it violates quite a few things that we talked about. You know, it's a closed-ended question. It projects the beliefs on the customer, and it's also leading. Okay, so how to create structure for the interviews. First of all, you outlined the goal of the interviews. You already understand who you want to talk to. You create your questions. The next step is to how to organize your interview. First, determine how many people you want to talk to. So ideally, you want to talk to between 10 and 20 people. There is no point to do customer interviews for less than 10 because you're not going to have enough information. I would recommend to do at least 20 interviews if you have this sort of project of doing the customer interviews. You want to learn about something, do at least 20 interviews, because you'll have a lot of different perspectives, and that will be a more sort of all-around understanding of different types of customers that you have. Expect your interviews to be not longer than 30 minutes. If you have a customer who uses your product, who are very involved and feel like they can be engaged because they can help you build the product better that they use, maybe you can get them for an hour interview. But expect the customer interview going to be about 30 minutes. And it's a huge investment for somebody who doesn't know you, who's a prospect, who never heard of you, to give you 30 minutes of their time. So respect their time. But 30 minutes should be enough for you to extract important information from the conversation. This is, if you conducting a project of doing the interview, I found it very helpful to actually set aside some blocks where you'll be scheduling your interviews. So for example, the way I've done it is that I've put the blocks of 2-3 hours in the morning where I would allow customers to book interviews for this time, especially in Europe. I'm in California. It's some time difference. And then I would put aside 2-3 hours in the afternoon. But what happens is that you know that you're going to be working, interviewing customers for 2-3 hours, maybe a few of them in a row. This will allow you to dive in and to get context from one interview to another, and you're going to be been having much more productive conversation, because you're going to be improving from one interview to another, rather than having one customer interview, then go to a marketing meeting, then have another customer interview, then go to another meeting inside of your organization. Just make sure you block this time together, because very often you will hear something on one interview and you will be able to ask and clarify that with the next interview. So it's going to be right on top of your mind. Number 4, you want to identify members who should be part of your interview. I highly recommend to have at least 2, but preferably 3, 4, or even 5 people listening to the interviews. And the reason is that your team, every team member that you have, whether it's a product person, whether it's a marketing, whether it's a developer or designer, they have different perspective. And of course, you can record interviews, but it's very hard to make people to listen interviews when it is recorded. It's much easier for them to follow the live conversation. The other reason you want to invite more than one person for the interview, that you want to make sure that somebody helps you think of another question. So maybe they have an interesting perspective. But be warned, you don't want to have 5 people interrogating the customer. You still want to have 1 or maybe maximum 2 person asking questions, and if your team member has another question, they can either write you on a piece of paper, or they can message you in a different Slack, and the person who's actually doing the interview can ask this question of the customer. But having those people live attending the interviews will allow you to, all of you receiving live conversations and live information that you can then share and discuss, because we are understanding different parts of your teams will understand the feedback from the customer in different ways. Number 5, very simple, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Get tools to help you. It's sometimes people reach out to me to do interviews, and I'm always happy to do that because I'm doing a lot of them myself. But it's super annoying when the conversation takes too many back and forth. We try to schedule interviews. How do you what is the right way? So make sure when you have this process, make sure that it's super short, super easy to say yes, and it doesn't require any other back and forth. So that's why I use Calendly. I actually use Mixmax, but you can also use Calendly. And of course, Hangouts and Zoom is very helpful, especially if you want to record your interviews. So this is all about planning. We talked about how to formulate the problem. We talked about how to figure out who to talk to and what questions to have and how to structure interviews. So let's talk about the setting, how to set interviews. Well, we talked about that if you want to do interviews, you want to talk to the customers and you want to talk to your prospects. So the goal for if you want to do research a problem, you want to have between 10 and 20 interviews. And that means you want to have some of the prospects and some of your customers. So when you do outreach to prospects, I do that through email and LinkedIn. I find LinkedIn actually to be quite effective. But the formula that I kind of keep in mind, because doing this for a while, I realized this is, if I do the right messaging, typically you would have 100 call messages you're going to send. You're going to get about 30 response and about 10 interviews are going to be scheduled, because sometimes people say, hey, they'll respond to you. They say, yeah, I'm sure I'll be able to have interview, but it's they're going to forget to respond back or never reply to your follow-up email and so forth. And so this will allow you to understand that if you want to have to schedule 20 interviews, that means you have to reach out to about 200 prospects. So make a list of the prospects that you want to talk to, so that you know exactly who you're sending the message in order to get those 10 to 20 interviews. If you're to get your customers to talk to you, you need to reach out to them. But it's very depends on what type of product you have and what kind of relationship you have with your customers. It's actually easier for obvious reasons to talk to your customers than your prospect, because A, they heard about you, B, they're using your product, and you can always talk to them in a sense, position this conversation as for them to share their expertise to improve your product, and they have sort of this incentive to make your product better. So it's hard for me to estimate, but I think if you reach out to 20, 50 of your customers, if you have, you'll be able to understand what kind of formulas and what kind of response you get to get them on the call. So create a target list. It's nothing too groundbreaking here. Use LinkedIn. It works super easy. It's easy to research the companies. It's easy to see the title of your customers and prospects, and it's also easy for them to see you. You're also easy for them to see what company you're from and what title do you have. And it's having that face attached to the name is quite helpful in the response, because it's much more personal than email. But email works too. Email is very direct. So, and very often if somebody is not replying through LinkedIn, I'll send them email as one of the follow-ups. Or if I don't have the LinkedIn and I have some sort of email list, I will also send a request for the interview. Again, I'll try to make it personal. Since it's a very personal process, you're not looking for many interviews, you're looking for just 20, 30 of them. And if you have to send 200 messages, that's okay, but try not to be copy paste. Make sure you don't make sure that you call them the right name, from the right company and things like that. So how to develop outreach messages. Couple of things. Be honest and direct about the purpose of your message. So I go in and I say right away who am I and why I want to talk to them. Just be honest, be direct. Don't try to sugarcoat anything. Just asking for your time. Want to talk to you. Want to get your expertise. Want to get feedback. Tell them why. I feel it's very helpful because they sometimes people think they're gonna be sold on the product. Sometimes they will basically feel like there's certain hidden reasons why I want to talk to them. So tell them why. Tell them that maybe you're building a product, but you're not going to sell it right now. To you, what you're trying to do is understand the problems that you have, because we're going to be building product to somebody like you. Or, for example, we're building messaging for our organization. We wanted to understand how our potential customers talk about the problems they want to highlight. That leads to a third suggestion, is that do not sell. Ensure that you're not going to be selling your product. These customer and prospect interviews are not about your product, unless there's small instances where you want to talk specifically to your customers about certain product features you want to launch. But again, this is a different types of conversation, because you're still going to talk about the problem, and then you can say, hey, what do you think about solving this problem this way? And but it definitely does not involve selling the product. Make sure you're very upfront that you do not sell, selling the product is not the goal of this conversation. Be concise. It's very important. Unfortunately, we're very limited on attention these days, and I've seen a few times where people reach out to me specifically with paragraphs and sentences, because people feel that providing more information will help me to respond, but I just don't have time reading it. So you want to give enough information to interest people, and then if they have questions, they'll ask you questions, then you can elaborate what exactly you're doing. So if your message that you're doing reach out is more than 5 sentences, go back to the drawing board and rewrite your messages. It should not be more than 5 sentences. And I'll show a few examples of my messages that I've used previously. Be specific about time commitment. In my messages, I typically say that I would like to talk to you for 20 minutes. And when I schedule interview, I typically schedule 25, but I think people understand how we sort of chunk times these days. It's either an hour or a half hour interview. So when I say 20, and by automatically, I think Mixmax scheduled 25. I think people expect that 30-minute interview is the limit. But don't tell them it's going to be 20-minute interview and then schedule a 1 hour on their calendar, because it's going to be a very negative response. They feel that they got trapped by you. You ask for a little bit of time, and then you're asking for a lot. And we reduce administrative work. And again, we talked about a little bit that you want to use tools that allow you to easily schedule the call, like Calendly, like Mixmax. There's quite a few products in there, because if they're willing to help, you want to reduce the amount of time it takes to schedule the call. That's why I use Mixmax, where I provide them 3 or 4 or 5 options for the interview. And basically all they need to do is click on whatever option works for them, and the interview will be scheduled automatically. The invite will be sent. Everything about the interview details will be included in the invite. Offer incentives. So this could be tricky because I personally do not like use incentives in general. When I talk to the prospect for the customers, I try to appeal to their expertise. I try to appeal that we really want to learn from you. We really value expertise, But in some instances, offering incentives might be helpful. For example, if you're talking to your customers and you want to basically say thank you, you want to provide some sort of gift card for $20 so they can buy a book on Amazon or something like that, or maybe you can offer a book or something like that. But make sure you don't overdo it, because you don't want to provide this type of incentive that that makes customers talk to you just because of incentive. You still want to find people that are willing to share the information, and incentive basically as a way to say thank you to them. So don't overdo it on the part of incentive. So when you do outreach, make sure you follow up. So my rule of thumb is 3 follow-ups. I find it's very effective, and people typically respond to you in 3 follow-ups. Obviously, like it means in the personal world, no means no. Do not force people, but at the same time, it's not a cold outreach email of your salespeople where you can see 8 and 10 and even 12 emails sent out if you don't hear from from a prospect. So I typically send 3. And I typically highlight in the third follow-up that, this is my last follow-up, so don't worry. And this is why I like to use LinkedIn, because I can see if they see the message. Because if they see the message for 3 times and they have not responded, I assume that they're not interested, which is probably true. So LinkedIn cold outreach strategy. There is nothing crazy here, but I just wanted to share this how I do it. When I put the list of 200 people I want to talk to, I basically did the research on LinkedIn. I put the LinkedIn profiles, and I was not connected with a lot of them. So what I have done is first, as the first message, I send them a connection request, but I make it very personal. I say something, hey, John, I want to connect and ask you whether you'll be open to answer a few questions about content strategy. We conduct an interview, something like that, something personal, and I'll show a few examples of that. And if they accepted the connection, I basically try to follow up in the same day with my first message saying, hey, thanks for connecting, and yes, we're doing this research, and would you be open to schedule a call and share your expertise with us? And if the connection, if they do not accepted my connection request, I send them a LinkedIn email. And if they have not responded, maybe I will try one more time. If I have their email, I'll send them email saying that, hey, I have tried to connect with you on LinkedIn. Again, I'm not selling you anything. We're just doing research. This is my last attempt to talk to you. So if you're open to schedule a 20-minute interview, I would really appreciate that. And if they basically accepted your connection request and they did not respond to your first follow-up question, then you send the second follow-up question. I typically wait for a day or 2. And then I'll wait, if they haven't responded for my second question, I wait another day or 2 and send a final follow-up. So this is a question, this is examples of things that I've been using. You see, this specific example, this was my first attempt. I basically stated right away, we're researching how marketers, content writers manage content creation distribution process. It would be great to talk to you and tap into your expertise. Would you be open to have a 20-minute call? This is sent again to the same person. I'm acknowledging that you're very busy, but if you can find 20 minutes to share your experience in managing content in the organization, we'd really appreciate it. Again, I don't provide a lot of details because I feel that if they respond to that, it's a very easy message. It's just a couple of sentences. I can provide more information if necessary. And the third message, this is my last message. Again, this is just an example. I have a few ways of structuring those messages, but here's basically I'm saying, hey, I'm sorry to bug you again. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I would like to ask you about your experience in content creation distribution. Would you be open to have a quick 20-minute call? This is my last attempt, and thanks for considering. And if I do not hear back from this, I will just let it go and move to another prospect. This is another example. Again, I wanted to give you a few, but the highlight here that you see this is this person actually, you can see it's this person actually became a connection. So this was the message that I included right in my invite through the LinkedIn, and it fed the limited amount of characters. But if you can also see, it basically says everything I need to say. You know, I'm researching this process again. I want to talk to you. Would you be willing to talk to? So then this is a little bit longer, message, but still it's in a 3 to 5 sentence. I also breaking down into smaller paragraphs, so it's easier to scan. But I try to sort of be more elaborate of what and why we want to talk. So here I talk that, you know, we wanted to build something and you can help us do that. And again, third attempt here was, I know you've reached out already. I know I have reached out already, but I'm trying again. You know, if you'll be open to our feedback, they'll be very helpful for us. And this is a couple of examples that I have used when I send first connection request, because I basically stated exactly why I want to connect to them, because the reason was to try to have a conversation with them. So we talked about the setting of the interviews. We talked about the planning, how to formulate the problem. We talked about that you need to talk to the right people. We talked about how to create questions. We talked about how to reaching out to your prospects or customers. Then I would like to provide you with some suggestions of how to manage actual interview process, because, you know, it's very important. We talked about that it's important to be prepared, but it's also important to direct the conversation with your customers when you have them on the phone. So I want to provide you with 14 tips here. First of all, some basics. Do not forget the research person that you're talking to. I know you think, well, duh, but I have to say it happened to me twice. It's super embarrassing, especially when you have 2-3 interviews scheduled in a row and you forgot that you talked to Joe and now you are talking to Mary. So what I do, I have the LinkedIn profile open all the time, and every interview I have, I take like a piece of paper and just Joe, and I just put it on my script so that I don't forget that I'm talking to Joe. Every time I want to refer to the name, I have Joe right on my piece of paper that I'm interviewing. Bring your team members into your interview. I've mentioned that it's great to have your members part of the interview, invite them. I highly suggest to do customer interviews in teams. Of course, somebody should be responsible, should be driving the project, but it's important that the team will be part of this interview process as well, because a lot of people can draw different type of conclusion and understanding from the same interview. Be prepared and be on time. I mean, it's also obvious, but be prepared that I share that one doc script that I have, and for each customer interview, I print another one. I think that if you remember, and I'll show that again, is that that script is just a page or page and a half, but I basically highlight, bold the most important part of the question, like challenges, like goals and objectives, because I do not want to read questions when I have interviews, but you want to just have an ability to just look at, scan it, like, okay, oh, I forgot the question about the process, what process they have, and I can rephrase the question. It doesn't necessarily mean that the interview you have with the customers, you're reading questions word by word every time, but you want to make sure that you kind of have the big picture. You don't forget important things to ask. First of all, Force talked about it a little bit too. Introduce yourself very briefly and explain the goal of your interview. And this is just to set the mood for the customer, just so they know why you want to talk to them. Just in general, we just want to learn how you manage your assets. And this will allow them to sort of have the context of the conversation they're going to be having right away. Ask for permission to record interview. It's again, this is an ethical issue. You don't want to record anybody who does not want to be recorded, but most of the time people will be okay with that. And as soon as you just say that you're recording this for the fact that you want to focus on the conversation and not on taking notes, not be distracted by taking notes. Build a rapport and be interested, ensure that the interview feels comfortable. And this is where this first sort of chit chat about, oh, you work for this company. I tried to find something, part of the prepare for the interview when I look at their profile on LinkedIn and, write down their name. I tried to see if I can sort of say something that will have a certain instant connection. Maybe I know the company that they're working for or worked before. Maybe I know somebody in that company that, or I have heard something positive news on online that I would like to highlight. But basically, this type of very quick connection allow you to build the trust and allow the customers to share more information. Important part of that, it's the interview should feel like an interview. It should not feel, like an interview. It should feel like a conversation, meaning that it's not they're not in the position. It's not a process of just reading questions to them and writing them down. What you want to make them feel as this conversation, this interview is a conversation. Don't bombard with the questions. Just make sure that it's a nice flowing conversation. Number 8, direct the conversation, and there's some instances where you'll have to interrupt them politely. So there was a couple cases when I was doing customer interviews where the person, I asked the person a question and they went into 5 or 7 minute tirade about how everything political in the organization when it comes to content, how the not appropriate people involved in the process, how everything is broken, how some people not understand the value that they do. So while this is helpful to provide the context for the how the customer operates in organization, how the team operates, it's not very helpful for me to spend 7 minutes out of 30 minutes talking about the problem that A, I understood, and B, there is nothing I can do about it. There's nothing you can help them do in to improve their political situation in a particular company. So the way I do is that I try to interrupt very politely, say, hey, Joe, yeah, I got it. I'm very sorry to hear it, but let me ask you another question. And this way I can channel and drive the conversation to another topic that are more interested or the topics that are more important for me. Another thing is I've had this very weird interview where the person was willing to go on an interview. We introduced ourselves and I started asking questions, and every answer I get is like, yeah, I don't feel comfortable talking about it, and I don't feel comfortable sharing this information with you, and then I don't want to talk about it. And then after 3 or 4 questions, I realized that the conversation doesn't go anything, and I decided to be very upfront and say, you know what, I thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and uh, I want to be very respectful of your time, and it seems like there is information that you cannot share. Maybe it's for multiple reasons, maybe it's a privacy reason. So I don't think this interview can be productive. So how about we give ourselves back, 20, 25 minutes of the day, and we're both sort of cut the interview short just because it wasn't going this very well. And this is something that is a good um, this is a good thing to know how to do as well, because you might need it. Embrace silence and ask for specifics. So remember I told you about these questions that I would really like to ask about. In an ideal world, how would you see this problem solved? In an ideal world, what do you, so it's very abstract and conceptual questions, and they might actually have not been thinking about that before. And you might, and this requires them to think on the spot. So do not get yourself into the conversation, and it's very difficult for me to do as well, because you hear this uncomfortable silence and you want to jump in and give them some ideas because you've done a lot of interviews, you know what people might say, and you want to kind of give them idea, help them out. Don't do that. Let them be silent for a while, let them think about it, and when they start talking, then you can drill down into more specifics, but make sure that you provide them with a space and silence to think about. We talked about leave your beliefs at the door, but I really want to talk about some particular example that happened to me so many times, and I realized that this is a wrong approach to do interviews. That since we were doing interviews to understand customer problems, so we had some sort of assumptions of what type of product you want to build. So every time when I would go on an interview, I ask questions and I understand that they have this problem, I get so excited, like, and I jump into the conversation and I start like, oh my God, this is so great you said it, because this is exactly what we think too. And this is exactly why we want to talk to you about it. And this is exactly why I build this product. So you got super excited, but what it does is it interrupts the flow of the interview. That means that you start talking more. You actually reaffirming something that the customer says, so they feel that they're saying the right thing. They're going to be saying that more and more. So don't forget, the interview is for you to learn. That requires your customers to talk. It's not about you talking, it's about the customer sharing information with you. So it's a very difficult thing to do. And every time we're like, sometimes, you hear something that you want person to hear, and you're just like, yes, 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 yes. But like, you have to hold yourself and just don't make sure that this feeling does not impact the way you do the interview. Number 11, ask questions in different ways. So you should, and this comes with practice, the more interviews you do, you'll figure out there's different ways to ask questions about process. There's different ways about ask about the problems the customer have. You sometimes will feel that the customer did not understand the question. So try to paraphrase the answer for them. Try to paraphrase the questions that you're asking them. Make sure that you are as clear as possible. Don't just rely on just written question on your brief, on your script. And this is why I say that it's better not to read those questions when you do the interviews, because they will sound scripted. You want to make sure that it's a sort of a flow conversation. And paraphrasing is also part of the active listening. It's important to it's an important way to understand that you understood the customer in the right way, and an ability actually for the customer to correct if they hear something that does not feel they don't think is the right way of what they communicated. Look for problems that could be solved and successes that could be replicated. Problems will allow you to help them and understand how you can make an actionable change to your product, to your marketing. And successes will allow you to understand how you can this particular solution in one company can be exported to other companies as well. Number 13, practice active listening. So active listening is, in general, is a way of asking different questions and follow-up questions of your customers. It's paraphrasing the answers that they have to make sure that you understood them right. And what I also find very helpful when I do customer interviews is that, since it is recorded, but I do try to make quick bullet points or just one or two phrases, so that, you know, sometimes customer talks in very details and I don't want to forget what to ask, so I just write something very quickly. And when you write a phrase or two, you actually reinforce your active listening, because you're actually focusing on the content that they're talking about. And the last thing is 14, be respectful of your time. So it is important to always have the time of the conversation somewhere so you can see. You don't want to go over time, and you have to understand that if the call goes for 30 minutes, they have a meeting coming up, they need to go, they're very busy people, you want to respect the time. 3 minutes or 5 minutes before, typically what I do is say, hey, I know we have a couple of minutes left, I have one question, so I'll have to ask, and then I'll let you go. Sometimes I feel like I still want to ask a few questions. So what I would do is that, hey, I know we have 2-3 minutes left. Would you have another 5 minutes if I can ask you another question? So just, it will be super helpful if we can stay for another 3-4 minutes. And if they say no, I have a meeting before that, then you just be respectful and no worries. Maybe I'll just, if you'll be open, I'll send you email. Maybe you can help through the email. If not, that's totally fine. But just make sure you are very respectful of their time. And last step is analyzing, summarizing feedback. So since you're having these customer interviews, as I suggested, in a groups, what you want to do is to have those circle back with your group after the conversation. If you have a blocks of conversation for maybe a few conversations back to back, you want to get back to your group for 30 minutes and just basically summarize in bullet points who got what is the most important part from each conversation. It's super important to kind of get your team aligned, that you all as a team, that you understand the information that you received in a holistic way. So analyzing interviews, what question you want to answer? You want to first of all summarize it in a way that understands what are the things that came up multiple times through multiple interviews. Because if you've done 10 interviews, you want to say, okay, so 8 of them said this process that they use, and the 8 of those interviews, you want to connect those dots, you want to connect those patterns. Then you want to understand what interviewers provided the most useful feedback, for a couple of reasons. First of all, the useful feedback, it could be very surprising feedback, and useful feedback means that there is actionable feedback that you can take. You want to outline those viewers, because later on they maybe become your product counsel. Maybe they'll be willing to share more feedback going forward, and you want to make sure that you kind of circle, put a check mark next to their name that this is a person that knows about this industry quite well, and I want to maybe talk to them again. And also understand where those people coming from. Maybe those people that provide the best feedback actually coming from the same organization with the same title, similar type of organization, similar type of title. That means that there'll be a great ideal customer profile for you, and this is again the way for you to connect the dots between the interviews. What you have learned from this process? So I found it's very helpful that after each interview, you sort of have 1 or 2 bullet points, specifically what surprised you about this process, or this specific interview from this particular person. Maybe you just want to, maybe it's just one thing, maybe just 2, maybe it's more, but just highlight what is this was surprising. One of the things that to give you an example here, when I was conducting interviews for Publish Now, I was speaking with a company that did gaming, and for them the content about the games was just a blog post. And it was super surprising for me to know that they actually right away, even with a small team, translate their content to many, many languages just because this gaming industry is so worldwide spread. And for me, that was interesting, because meaning that if they are required to translate the content for multiple languages, that means they need to upload this content through multiple resources. So it's how do they do that? And that sort of allowed me to understand a little bit different perspective for the companies for whom the translation is quite different. So make sure that you highlight things that could be surprising. So that's kind of relates to it. And how you can improve your customer interviews. So you always want to understand what are the things that you can do to improve your customer interviews. And it's good to kind of have this conversation with a team so people can throw different ideas of how to phrase this question differently, or maybe how to structure the interview differently, or maybe how to start from different steps. So with that, this is just an example of how I summarize the interview. So, for me, it was just a name. I put a title and the company. Then I write, couple sentence context. This is basically, well, Max is a founder of a small startup. This is what is important for them. And when I talk about what is important for them is I highlight sort of bullet points of the things that they mentioned that are important for them, or maybe things that were important for us to hear. And I have a link to the call that was recorded. The reason why also it's very helpful, and this is especially when I did 20 and more interviews, is that you did a lot of interviews, and you maybe heard somebody said something interesting, and then nobody said it, and you kind of forgot about it, and then boom, your 25th or 23rd interviews, you hear this point again. It's like, oh my God, I've heard this before. That's a very interesting point. I want to go back and revisit the interview with the first person. And then you start, oh my goodness, who that first person is? How do I find that call to get more perspective? So when you have this breakdown sort of summary of the interviews, you can basically scan it very quickly. You can figure out what interview you want to listen, and scroll to that part where talks about that in more details. So final thoughts. Let me leave you with final thoughts here. Conduct regular customer interviews, at least one per week. This will allow your marketing, your product team, invite multiple members to that interview. Number two, create a product console. If you can create 5 to 10 people that will be invested, this is maybe you can incentivize with whom you can share your product maps, your ideas, your messaging, who would be a very good representation of ideal customers and who have knowledge in the industry that you want to tap to, because they will provide you very quick feedback on the things you want to launch. And number three, include your whole team, preferably your whole go-to-market team, to your interviews. So this will allow you to get different perspective and get your team aligned. So with that, I will open up for the questions. And just before we start, I will make sure after this call, I will send you a PDF of an outline of this interview. I will also share the questions that you've seen that I've created for the interviews I've done previously. And I will send you a feedback questionnaire. How do you like this webinar? What things you would like to learn more? What you liked, what you don't like, so forth. And I will let you guys ask any questions. Happy Friday. So no questions, or people are shy, or which is probably less likely, I shared quite a few information. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Mick. Thank you so much for such a impressive webinar. It was really insightful. I learned a lot here, and pretty much the only question I have. In one of the last slides you said conduct at least one interview a week. Did you mean customer or prospect interview?
I think you can. It's less whether it's a prospect or a customer. Maybe you can do one or the other each week, but I think it's important to do once per interview. And it's interesting conversation. I actually talked to, I forgot the name of the company recently, that actually where the product chief product officer forces team to have at least one interview per week. And I've been advocating this for a long time, but it's very difficult, and with all other priorities, I think it's important to put together 30 or 1 hour a week to be able to talk to your customers, because this is what's important. So in terms of whether it's customer prospect, try to use one or the other. If you can do both and spend an hour, it's even better. Have you used coding software to code responses instead of logging into a spreadsheet? No, I have not. This is, I actually talked to I know that sales, I forgot the name of the product. I can come back to you. I know the person to ask, but I know there's a product that salespeople use that could integrate with your Zoom, and they basically transcribed a lot of like most of the conversation, and you can have it in text. But I do like to make notes myself, because it allows me to remember it myself, and I don't need the whole content when I summarize the interviews. I just like to have it in bullet points so I can find it easily. Do you usually, oh, that's a great question, Roberto. I actually do not like to use video conference myself. Um, and this is a good, and the reason why is I feel that sometimes the visual can be distractive. So when I use Zoom typically, but I would say the majority of my interviews I do not turn on the camera, and the customer does not turn the camera if you don't turn on. This is interesting thing that I've seen. And the reason why that when I listen to the person, you know, I can walk, I can stand, and I can just basically focus on the words they say. Maybe, you know, if that would be in person interview, I think it's important to get the visual and see the reactions. But I do prefer to have interviews without video. Um, that's an interesting, because I've been thinking about that for a while now. How do you actually use the information obtained in the interviews in your product discussions? Well, the ideal, let's say, you know, for I can give you a couple examples. For the publish now, when we were just building a product, we had some sort of prototype. So the way we wanted to use the interviews is to identify what to work on. So we had a list of 5 different problems to solve, and we conducted interviews basically to prioritize, to understand what is the better things to focus first, and some of them put aside. So this is what we used it for, to prioritization. Another way of using it is that I've seen it that you conduct the customer interviews to understand the problem better. So it's maybe less about, you know, what you're building, but like, we want to produce this feature, but are we understanding the problem right? So I think that one of the best way to kind of get the the use the customer interviews is to summarize the problem after those interviews. Just write down things, just state the problem that the customer have, and maybe it's just a few or 3 statements. So when you come back to the discussion with your product team, you know exactly what type of problem you guys trying to solve, and align it along those. I hope that was helpful. Did I answer that question? All right. All right, guys, if you have any other questions, please send me to them. Um, and I hope that was helpful. And guys, I would really appreciate if you can answer my questionnaire that I'll send an email, and I will provide the PDF and outline, so maybe you can use some of those ideas for questions in your interviews. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Bye-bye. And happy Friday.